Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Gina Vensel, and I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to be on the American team for Eden Foundation, supporting the marketing and PR for Psychedelics as Medicine. I'm delighted to be moderating an all-female panel today, Psychedelics in the Spotlight, Shaping Media and Shaping Minds, with three incredible women that I greatly admire. And desire. Quickly about me, I'm the co-founder of Plant Media Project, a women-owned boutique media company where we specialize in cannabis and psychedelic brand and organizational marketing and events. I currently serve as the Director of Community and Media Partnerships for MAP Psychedelic Science 2025, so hopefully you'll all come to Denver this summer and join us. And I'm also the Director of Communications and Events for Students for Sensible Drug Policy, and you can visit us. I'm out on the lobby to learn more. Now I'd like to introduce you to our panelists today. First, we have Annie O'Carrison, the co-founder and electoral director of Lucid News, which was founded as a for-profit news service in 2020 to cover research, business, policy, and culture in the psychedelic ecosystem. Lucid News has just launched a nonprofit organization to help support journalists and train reporters to cover the field of psychedelics. It's called the Lucid News Community Media. And trained as a science journalist, Annie is also the co-founder of the Women's Visionary Council, the first nonprofit in the US for psychedelic women. She develops harm reduction systems for psychedelic festivals and gathering, and is a member of several psychedelic communities in her hometown in the San Francisco Bay Area. For over the past 7 years, and Philippi, our next panelist here, has become a leading voice in the psychedelic domain. With her podcast, The New Health Club, she interviews the who's who of the psychedelic industry. She has started her own foundation, the New Health Institute, to further pursue the mission to destigmatize psychedelic mental health care and therefore bridge the gap between hard science and people in the need of real healing. And finally, we have Dr. Julie Holland, psychiatrist and author of many books, and the New York Times bestsellers Moody Bitches and Weekends at Bellevue. She is the editor of two nonprofit books, Ecstasy, The Complete Guide, and The Pot Book, A Complete Guide to Cannabis. While now a medical advisor to MAPS, she was a medical monitor for several clinical studies examining the efficacy of using MDMA-assisted psychotherapy or cannabis in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. Her newest book is Good Chemistry, The Science of Connection from Soul to Psychedelics. So first, let's give them a round of applause, please. And from American media to European, we have lots to talk about, and we're going to dive right in with Annie O'Carrison here, a leading psychedelic journalist in America. And there's a lot to talk about and what's happening in America right now, and I'm going to really try to keep us so that we can talk a lot. But we have to just dive in to talk about the current state of where we are in media in the US and its impact that it's having on the psychedelic movement.
Thank you, Gina. I took some notes, forgive me, I'm a journalist. There's a lot to say.
There is.
I think it's important to take a holistic and informed approach to covering psychedelics that doesn't contribute to the hype or overplay or underplay the risks involved with psychedelics. There's been a lot of hype about psychedelics in the press in the US and elsewhere, and suggestions that psychedelics are a panacea for mental health, and also coverage that treats psychedelics like some sort of throwback to the 1960s, which is inaccurate and a dated approach. So we see these kinds of approaches being taken by media coverage and the press throughout the world, unfortunately. There is an international community of researchers, policy activists, and practitioners who have deep knowledge about psychedelics. Many of you are here today, and it's important that in a field that's rapidly expanding, in a great moment of expansion of interest in these compounds, that we offer accurate information, and that reporters go to people who understand psychedelics deeply and have really good sources for that information. We stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, some of whom made sacrifices to gather that information and do this research and gather that knowledge and wisdom, including indigenous peoples around the world, And it's important to acknowledge that and for journalists to reach out to that expertise. We've built a community of reporters and writers of opinion pieces to cover research, business, and policy surrounding psychedelic-assisted therapies. We also cover pharmaceutical companies developing new molecules and clinical trials, state regulatory frameworks, the underground market for psychedelics, harm reduction, and underground therapies in psychedelic churches. Personal use of psychedelics is, of course, the main way that most people ingest psychedelics presently, and I think it's important to remember that. We also do briefings for groups like PSFC. We help moderate gatherings for the global psychedelic societies, and we've built a website called Psychedelic U, which provides harm reduction information. So I think the community approach, which this conference is certainly embracing, is the right approach to be able to understand psychedelics deeply and get some important and accurate information out to the public. Our goal as journalists is to cover all these topics as accurately as possible with balanced and fair reporting that looks at both the risks and promises of psychedelic therapies and their personal use in non-clinical environments as well. We train journalists to cover these stories, and we also do media trainings for therapists and groups like the Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics. And after reporting on this field for 5 years, we've created an archive of information about psychedelics that is now being harvested by AI tools and the mainstream press when they cover these stories. So it's important to give back to the communities that we're part of, the communities that have supported us, the communities of researchers and knowledge that help build this knowledge base. One of the largest stories that we've covered last year, which is still unfolding, was the rejection by the FDA of the Lykos Therapeutics proposal for MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, and the concerns raised by the FDA advisory panel in response to public testimony about ethical issues surrounding the clinical trials and the strength of the data. The story really showed a depth of concern among people who follow psychedelic therapies about ethical issues, transparency, and scientific rigor in these investigations, and the importance of reaching out to the FDA advisors, both Lykos and MAPS, who had worked with the FDA for years to develop these clinical trials, I think learned an important lesson there. The FDA required that Lykos Therapeutics conduct another phase 3 clinical trial, which is very costly. Lykos has not yet announced whether they have raised the money to do that, but I think it's likely they have. It's been a year now almost. And, there's also going to be a restructuring of management at Lykos, which is a public benefit corporation, but also a pharma company, and also at MAPS. Which, as I said, established and supported the clinical trials for MDMA-assisted therapy. So there's going to be some interesting developments that we're going to continue to follow. It could lead to greater transparency about data used in clinical trials and important discussions about the structure of clinical trials and scientific research. Also about the pricing model for psychedelic therapies, which is costly under some models, and the potential for less costly group therapies, and the possible separation of therapies that use perhaps MDMA only or MDMA combined with psychotherapy, which of course is more costly. And also, the FDA decision has given rise to a lot of speculation about the future role of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and his potential impact on the FDA. RFK Jr. has been confirmed as the Secretary of Health and Human Services at HHS in the US, which oversees the FDA and the National Institutes of Health, NIH, and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, which Kennedy has called corrupt in public statements. So It's going to be interesting to see what happens there. Kennedy has called into question the usefulness of vaccines, which he later denied in his confirmation hearings, and has opposed vaccine mandates, even for school children, which has caused a lot of concern in the U.S. While he comes from a famous family of Democrats, he was confirmed without a single Democratic vote, and his own family has spoken out against him. He has advocated for personal choice and health issues and spoken out about the overuse of pharmacological drugs and processed food. But even Republican senators like Lisa Murkowski are concerned about his selective interpretation of scientific data and studies. So there is some concern there. He has said in interviews, RFK Jr., that his son has benefited from an experience with ayahuasca. And here's a quote. RFK Jr. saying in an interview, quote, "My mind is open to the idea of psychedelics for treatment. People ought to have the freedom and the liberty to experiment with these hallucinogens to overcome debilitating disorders." So there appears to be some openness in his thinking there. It will be interesting to see what happens. However, the Trump administration is proving to be very transactional in its approach to governing. Some of the actions that it has taken since it came to power the last few weeks could undermine scientific research in general and psychedelics in particular in terms of federally supported research that investigates psychedelic therapies, such as MDMA-assisted therapy for PTSD, which has been especially embraced by the veterans community in the US and elsewhere. It's really a rare issue with bipartisan support, and there was a lot of hope that the US Veterans Administration would really lead the way for future research because there is so much bipartisan support for that. However, the U.S. is going through a profound transformation in the structure of its government and its approach to international leadership and access to information, which is being led by the Trump administration. Last weekend, federal workers in the U.S., including the Veterans Administration, were trying to figure out how to respond or whether to respond to a message put out by special government employee Elon Musk over the weekend, who sent out an email saying that federal workers needed to explain their work last week or risk losing their job. Some federal workers were told by their department heads to comply, others were advised not to. Trump came out and said that the demand was ingenious and anyone who didn't respond is fired or semi-fired. Then a few hours later, the Department of Personnel Management formally notified federal agencies that the response was voluntary and failure to respond, quote, would not require resignation. CNN quoted a career employee of the Department of Veterans Affairs saying, quote, "It's hard to know who's in charge and who to listen to." And this is important because the VA was really seen as a leader in this space. Both Musk and Trump are leading the push to cut funding to the NIH and the CDC, which could have a chilling effect on access to scientific data and also potentially impact research into psychedelic-assisted therapies. The Trump administration has also prohibited the release of any public communication by the CDC until reviewed by a presidential appointee, and scientific information, including information on bird flu and other critical issues, has been removed from US government websites and databases. The Trump administration has proposed cuts in federal funding that would reduce research grants at universities and hospitals by billions and may discourage future research. At risk are research grants from the NIH to numerous hospitals. In 2024, the NIH spent at least $32 billion on nearly 60,000 grants, and many officials at universities and hospitals have been quoted as saying they may have to pull back on medical and scientific research. The 10 institutions that receive the most money from NIH stand to lose more than $100 million per year on average. Republicans have also proposed lowering the federal share of costs for Medicaid, a public health insurance program for low-income people, which could lead to a greater need for these therapies. The Association of American Medical Colleges and other groups have sued the federal government along with hospitals and educational organizations. They say that these moves will slow scientific progress. These and many other lawsuits will be making their way through the courts in the US, but there is no guarantee that the executive branch will abide by court orders, in which case that would mean an extrajudicial situation in the US where the rule of law is suspended.
I do want to mention that Students for Sensible Drug Policy, we actually took the DEA to court this year for placing 2 psychedelic research chemicals, DOI and DOC, on Schedule 1. So we need to start talking about these things, because when we do this, we're actually potentially halting psychedelic research, and these chemicals are really important for us to do the work that we're doing. So I just definitely wanted to mention that. And also, it feels like, you know, the Trump administration has really already put a halt on the ways in which media can even interact. I mean, I know that the Associated Press was not even allowed into the Oval Office like about a week ago or so, and we're seeing that now only certain media outlets are going to be allowed to even ask questions. So it's not just that our psychedelic community is being affected by this administration, but there's an actual halt on what's going to be allowed to be even spoken about within the new administration, and what questions are even going to be able to be asked.
Yes, may I comment on that?
Yes.
With my reserved time? Right, we can't talk about the press on a media panel without talking about the pressure on media and free speech that has taken place since the Trump administration took office and empowered Elon Musk as a special government employee to begin firing federal employees and halting federal funds for scientific research. This has the potential to impact both the media that covers psychedelics and other members of the press, of course. Groups such as the National Science Foundation now have to review active projects with a list of keywords to determine if they include activities that violate executive orders. According to the Washington Post, these words include words like trauma, barriers, equity, and excluded. The Trump White House is attempting to punish the Associated Press, as you just mentioned, a preeminent international news outlet and foundational part of the White House press pool, because it will not change its style book standard from the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf of America. The AP notes that this order only carries authority in the US, and of course it's an international news organization. Google, which of course is scanning the contents of your Gmail, has adapted the name change. And it's, I think, important to point out here that the control of language is an effort to control how reality is perceived. As Orwell pointed out in 1984 with his phrase, "Newspeak, words matter." In 1984, Sim tells Winston that, quote, "the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought," end quote. And how reality is perceived, right? I was trained in AP style. I had good training as a journalist at Columbia University, and that's what we follow at Lucid News and train our reporters to follow. Trump has now blocked AP reporters, but not photographers, from the Oval Office. The AP says it's being punished for the content of its speech, which is a violation of the First Amendment, and will likely mount a legal challenge to defend its constitutional rights and protest the infringement of the public's right to independent news coverage of their government and elected officials. Punishing journalists for not adapting language mandated by the state is an attack on press freedom. It's the weaponization of language, which could lead to what we call anticipatory obedience and self-censorship, and broad censorship within the media community in the US and elsewhere. A federal judge has now declined to temporarily restore AP's full access to the White House. Will the federal government now punish journalists for acknowledging transgender people in DEI initiatives, or for citing some of the scientific data that has now been eliminated or withdrawn from government websites and databases? The Trump administration says they will investigate groups that receive federal funding, including NPR. I've worked for several NPR member stations, and PBS. Musk is also talking about the possibility of, quote, a, quote, long prison sentence, unquote, for reporters at the US news show 60 Minutes, the most watched news magazine in the US on TV, Musk has attacked a Wall Street Journal journalist who broke the story about Doge's staffers' racist remarks and comments about eugenics. Musk says journalists should be fired and says this journalist should be fired immediately, and is arguing for the closure of taxpayer-funded groups like Radio Free Europe. He's accusing media outlets of committing crimes. Trump is suing CBS, who he says doctored an interview with Kamala Harris. Putting journalists in prison for their reporting is what the government does in China, Russia, and Iran. At a speech,
we could go on for hours about this, and I want to make sure we have enough time for everyone, though.
Absolutely,
Anne. So,
yes.
But I do want to say, if anyone wants to go on Google, you can report the Gulf of America as an incorrect statement and report it, so that maybe if we get enough people, we can from America, we can go ahead and report that. We'll see if we have some time at the end, but I want to take this to a broader context with you, Anne, because living in Berlin and having the podcast for so long. How is all of this affecting the broader European community? And then also from your perspective, where do we stand in a broader sense for psychedelics and media right now?
Well, as you all know, the elections have happened last week, and I'm not going to say it's a similar scenario, but it has a huge impact on German press, free press, I guess, too, which we will see. So the very conservative far-right party is now the second strongest party in the country, which will definitely have impact on reporting 100%, because I just heard also from sources that they're not very much interested in keeping the cannabis possibilities open, and they're already very little right now, so we'll see what happens there. But I really feel that it's a really interesting time to give this at least one positive spin, to create a new media system that we all can create here in this room, where we are here. And I'm very inspired, I have to say, by the Free Press, by Bari Weiss. She was a New York Times reporter, but she couldn't really express, I think, what she really wanted to express, so she created the Free Press. And it's insanely successful. She has a team now of 50 people, makes a lot of money with it. And that's why we also decided to open a foundation called the New Health Institute. And I did not do this alone. There somewhere in the audience is Philip Drexel. We should all talk to him. He's an interesting, very cool guy. So we did this together. And one thing is we will offer treatments to people, also ibogaine, who cannot afford it. But one really important thing is also to create a whole new content landscape, like around psychedelics, around healing stories, and in a way that coming from Condé Nast, from Vogue and GQ magazine, and I kind of used this also as a little kind of backdoor trick to make it look like it's a Hollywood story, but it's not. So, I mean, as we remember, the Matthew Perry reporting was so kind of, old media style, you could say, but there were so many elements that were never addressed. So, but still, it was a celebrity story. People clicked on it. There would have been a lot of opportunities to tell a different story with him. So, so that's why we also decided to do the podcast as a foundation tool now, and no longer like a commercial tool, because that's not possible with Meta, as we all know, that it's not going to be possible to promote it as a classic creator, like classic creator style. So, but somehow I'm really excited about this, creating this new media idea that we can really just redefine by ourselves and be independent from sometimes really old media who still want to have the war on drugs narrative, but also kind of are clever enough to go through certain social media channels that are not kind of kicked out or so. That's a really big challenge, but I'm super excited to do this for the next 20, 30 years.
And you mentioned about the New York Times journalist that moved, and I believe you said to me earlier today it was on Substack.
Yeah, Substack is a very important tool for the new speech, you could say, but also for an independent speech. And we in the beginning we had MailChimp, which is a newsletter service, and we got kicked out because I used psychedelics, the word. So then somebody said, just go to Substack. And they were like, yeah, please stay with us. We love psychedelics. And so this was like 4 years ago. So, and you can really create a strong, monetizable system on Substack.
Which is great.
Really,
and as you mentioned, the social media networks are very difficult. It's there's so much shadow banning across social media. It makes it very difficult for us to do our work, to share the information, and also to advertise it. You can get shut down from pretty much any advertising source, as well as it's difficult to buy media on any traditional mainstream media platform. So it's making it very difficult for us in the psychedelic space to share this authentic information. But finding tools like Substack, we talked earlier as well about LinkedIn being a way from a professional network that we're able to talk about things without getting shadow banned. And if you don't know what shadow banning is, it's pretty much being eliminated from the algorithm so that the posts that you're putting out are not seen or seen by a very few amount of people. And typically, if you put a little money against Meta, Facebook, they would allow your post to be seen more frequently. But if you go ahead to put money against it and you're in the psychedelic space, they'll reject your ads, and that could potentially put your page at risk.
Yeah, and you can really, you can almost like data test it by yourself. You photograph like a burger or turkey, and 500 story views.
Right.
And then you put like, I'm at a psychedelic retreat, like 10 views. So it doesn't seem like a coincidence to me. Kind of.
Exactly. So. And then Dr. Holland, I was wondering, we'll hopefully have some time at the end to continue some dialogue around this. But, Anne touched on how there's literally things being removed from government websites pertaining to medicalization. And, you've written so many books on the topic and things. Like, where do you feel in terms of, being a doctor and seeing the ways in which, psychedelics are being distributed through the media, and what challenges do you see in keeping the information authentic?
So many challenges. How do I feel? Terrified and overwhelmed. There's a lot of questions, there's a lot of hype and buzz, and people are clicking and wanting to learn about things. And my big fear, I'm harm reduction born and bred, and the most important thing to me is accurate information, accurate drug information. And I think that's really lacking. I feel like I kind of represent classic media, actually. Like most of my media exposures are like television, morning shows, and my whole sort of push to get on like the Today Show or Good Morning America or Kelly and Ryan, my push there was his dreamy eyes. I actually had like the biggest brain fart. Ryan Seacrest asked me a question, and then he looked like really interested in what I had to say. I was speechless. But luckily we were taping, it wasn't live. But that was an example of like morning TV, owned by Disney, very conservative, and they ended up giving me twice, I was supposed to go in for 4 minutes, it ended up being an 8-minute segment, and, Ryan was like, the audience has never been so quiet. Like, people really are starved for accurate drug information. So it's important to me to do the television and the radio and print and things like that, because that's still how the older people in my generation and most of America, that's how they're getting their information. And then the other side of that, and I'm not here, but I want someone else to be on the other side of that, is like a lot of people get health information from TikTok right now. And I don't really, as a nearly 60-year-old woman, want to go on TikTok and be like, hey kids, let me teach you a few things about drugs. But I'm tempted every day to do that because there isn't really accurate drug information out there for that generation, and that generation is using drugs. So for me, it really just comes down to harm reduction and education and public safety. So yes, I don't like that we can't access information from CDC. I'm very unhappy with any kind of censorship because it's a public health emergency when that happens. Bird flu is a real thing. And measles, you can die from the measles. So, like, vaccinations, ask these guys if their kids are vaccinated, and they are.
Right. Well, I know that I let each of you kind of talk on your topics, but if there's anything that you want to kind of discuss based on some of the things that you've heard, you all represent to me just some of like the leaders of this movement, and we're in this international stage right now. Is there any positive outlook? I'm glad we tried, because like it does feel like a challenging time. We're up against a lot of stigmas that still exist, and it's going to take all of us to kind of break down those barriers and work together in the media, and just anyone that's interested in these topics, that's researching and working on them. What can we do in our way to like help this movement forward?
I would have a question, because you're mainly in America also. Do you feel that the engagement of celebrities in the topic, is it actually helping or is it not helping? Because I keep thinking about this from Europe, looking at all these outlets, and then you have the athletes saying, I don't get a vaccine, but I do ayahuasca. And like the big podcasters, like the big 5 guys who talk about this. So do you think that is substantially supportive for this movement?
You want to take that?
In a perfect world, we're getting accurate, reliable, honest, unbiased drug information. Whoever is willing to deliver that, if they have a high Q rating, I'm all for it. I just don't want inaccurate drug information.
And I still think that, in America, we do put a lot of caliber into if you are famous, in whatever that way that means. And so sometimes that is more important than how intelligent you are, maybe, like how many TikTok followers you have or things might be more powerful. So I hope that we'll get more psychedelics in the news, but I am personally concerned with just because someone is famous, them delivering the message, because oftentimes it's from a very personal perspective without them really understanding the impacts that these medicines could have for people that really should maybe not be trying them, especially in an underground setting if they're on other medications or if they've never explored it before. So I still feel like it's a mixed bag of whether or not it's something that is good for our country.
This event is being live streamed. Hello to all the people watching us on the internet. If you're a famous person and you would like to impart some accurate information about psychedelics, reach out to some of the expertise in this room and offer accurate, up-to-date, balanced, unbiased information about psychedelics. You could make a difference in the world.
I also think we should talk about scripted TV. There's plenty of psychedelic sort of plot lines happening in all sorts of TV shows. I'm not necessarily going to list them. I'm sure you've seen it, for years. And I always, I want to be an advisor in that situation. I want, don't do that. That's not how it is. That's not how long it lasts. That's dangerous. Don't combine those 2 medicines. If it's fine to put it, I go to like mixers with content creators in the classic media space or the scripted TV, things like that. Like, I'm very interested in getting something on the air that's scripted, that's accurate. It could still be funny. It could poke fun of the psychedelic community. Can you imagine? Or it could be, dramatic or whatever. But like, it's so you can entertain people and be accurate. I mean, you see that like in a medical ER show now, like The Pit, where they're really making sure that everything is accurate that they're doing, and it's more fun to watch and it's educational. So edutainment, can be a thing.
I love that.
So, but I keep thinking about the perfect Apple TV show for psychedelics. So, would that be like Dr. Dreamy for psychedelics? I mean, we just mentioned the medical show, or would it be like an agent thing? So, what do you guys think is a good format to tell these stories? Or would it be healing stories? Would it be original healing stories? Would it be eventually also like personal, experiences that people talk about? So, what do you think is
I have a quick thing to say about that. Just from a biological point of view, if you're in fight or flight, you're not taking in a lot of new information and your social skills aren't very good. If you're in parasympathetic, not fight or flight, but the other side, rest, digest, repair, tend and befriend, that's when you're open to new information. And one of the easiest ways to get people open to new information is to make them laugh. So I feel like it's okay to have, a comedy that's funny, but also just as accurate.
Okay. I love that. What about you?
I think as we enter this interesting politically transitional time in the U.S., it will be increasingly important for leaders within the psychedelic space, content creators in the rest of the world, Iceland, Europe, other countries around the world, to really step forward and to offer accurate, unbiased, freely accessible information about psychedelics. And so I think there's an opportunity there to really learn from other cultures and to step back from what has been a U.S. Focus on this topic. I think there's an opportunity there.
But I feel also in Europe, I mean, let's say the last year, I feel like also people, let's say, growing up with the classic media, where I basically also come from. So there are more and more people in that age group, like Gen X and over Gen X, starting to reach out, like on our channels, and people I used to work with, like, hey, can I talk to you? I already know what's coming.
That's right.
So we haven't spoken in 20 years, so
yeah.
so I feel like this time weirdly also pushes people to really kind of get real with themselves also a little bit. Is my observation of the last year, basically, I have to say.
I think there's a lot of psychedelic curiosity in that way, and when you're public about your work in this space, it does open up your DMs to a lot of people and a lot of scammers that are trying to sell me DMT pens and all of those things. But for the most part, I mean, I've had a lot of people, and they range in age, that will just say to me, hey, I've seen that you've posted about this. I've been on medication for a long time, it doesn't seem to be helping, and I'm not a therapist, I'm a marketing and media person, and I'm very careful with what and how I, interact with people, especially if they're coming to me because they're in real need of healing. But I try to connect people with experts and try to use, things like the Fireside Project that we have in America, which is a 24-hour peer support line that's free that people can use before or after a challenging experience, and just providing resources for our community can be so important. And so sometimes I feel like we're almost stuck in this psychedelic bubble when we start to attend a lot of conferences and attend a lot of different events in this space and watch and listen to all the podcasts and information. And so we're getting that download all the time, but the rest of the world this is still very highly stigmatized. And in many cases, people, because of their jobs or their relationships and their families and communities, cannot openly, freely speak about this. So we are, everyone in this room, leaders in our own communities and conduits to giving this communication to others. And so if making people feel comfortable with coming to you, even if you yourself are not an expert, you're meeting and connecting with some of the best experts, and you're just one link away from sharing some really good knowledge that you're collecting today at this conference and beyond. So I'd really encourage each of you to be that connector for your communities to help get this, good information out.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's also important to remember that people who have, for years now, many people, spoken out about the use of psychedelics and psychedelic-assisted therapies, psychedelic spiritual and ceremonial use, were targeted for reprisal and action by law enforcement in the U.S. and in many other places around the world. People who talk about drugs, who use various substances, have also been targeted and still are. And I think it's really important for people to stand up for each other, to support free speech, so that people offering this information are not targeted and the subject of reprisals, and support an environment where accurate, balanced information can be exchanged.
And we have a little over 5 minutes left, and I wanted to talk about, in many ways, I feel like psychedelics is a movement and not quite an industry. And we were talking about the issues of not being able to advertise and do that. And each of you have mentioned something about nonprofits, whether it's starting your nonprofit media company, publishing nonprofit books. So I just wanted to speak at a moment of where we are in terms of why each of you have had to take that angle of going towards a nonprofit model and what that means for the broader sense of psychedelic
in my
media.
case, very quickly, I mean, I've learned in the last 4 years that, and I talk a lot to Joe Moore about this from Psychedelics Today, it is nearly impossible to get a bigger sponsor for a psychedelic podcast. I mean, let's say you have Joe Rogan, Andrew Huberman, it's always like AG1, 8 Sleep, or Rich Roll. There are all these 5 really big brands who always go into podcasts. None of these would be possible for a designated psychedelic podcast. So, but still, you really want to have, a good-looking, stylish, glamorous podcast. But there's no money for it by sponsors. So, and then at one point, I was like, well, maybe somebody donates the money, which actually it's how it started. So, and then I was like, well, then let's open a foundation and also at the same time include real stories from people healing. The first 5 people we work with are doing Ibogaine, and so we have their stories also in the podcast. Out of their stories will come other stories. So I think that like the actual active thing to do, or like let's call it activism, plus creating your own content landscape around it. I think that's quite a good way to go. And thank you, Substack, for whoever used it from Substack. Happy to be sponsored by you.
I've published 5 books, and 2 of them are nonprofit. And when it is nonprofit, it means it helps to fund clinical research, and that was done under the auspices of MAPS. But my other 3 books are totally for-profit, and I run a large private practice in psychiatry in New York City, and that is also for-profit. So, but I do try to donate my time quite a bit, and I'm on the board of various, things that I believe in, and I donate money to we should mention Erowid.org for reliable drug information, EROWID, Erowid.org. Fireside Project, which I believe is it fireside.org? Does that sound right? Fireside, as you mentioned, Gina, is peer support for people going through it. I'm involved in drug policy stuff, and every once in a while I will sit down and meet with a politician, which is always just terrible, just disheartening, and I had to stop doing it because it was more uplifting to be running the psychiatric emergency room at Bellevue Hospital and really making a difference. So it's such an uphill battle to work in government, and but so I just, it's kind of like I have patients who are actors, and they joke that they do one for the art, one for the bank, one for the art, one for the bank. And I feel like that's sort of, that I try to do some stuff because I get 2 kids in college, but then I also want to do nonprofit things.
Well, Lucid News was founded as a for-profit back in 2020. We founded it about a month before the COVID pandemic. We had no idea what was about to occur. But a few years ago, there was a major contraction in the psychedelic space for the funding of for-profits, for investment capital, essentially. And so we decided as a community of journalists who founded Lucid to really take a step back and think about our future. And we decided a few months ago to become a nonprofit, community-based organization. And we actually paused publishing for a little while to really think deeply about this, and we've since resumed publishing, and we've raised enough nonprofit donations to go forward, and we think that was the right decision. And I will also say that nonprofit organizations in the United States operate at the pleasure of the federal government, and you must apply to the federal government for nonprofit status.
Yeah. Great, and we're back to that again.
We're back to that, full circle. Well, as you can see, it's going to be a constant changing landscape, no matter whether you're in America or globally, because these stigmas still very much remain around psychedelics. And so hopefully with more events that are sharing this great research and great journalists and authors like you, that we're going to be able to combat those stigmas. So I appreciate all of you for your time today, and let's give a round of applause to our lovely panelists. Thank you all so much.